The fog rolled through Manhattan that Saturday morning like a living thing, thick and gray and swallowing everything in its path. You couldn't see across the street. You certainly couldn't see the top of the Empire State Building. Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith, Jr. was 27 years old, a decorated bomber pilot fresh from the European theater. He'd flown 42 combat missions over Nazi Germany, survived flak and fighters, and the 1,000 ways war tries to kill you. Now he was flying a routine transport mission from Massachusetts to Newark Airport, carrying 2 passengers in his B-25 Mitchell bomber. The weather was bad. LaGuardia Tower warned him, visibility near zero. They couldn't even see the top of the Empire State Building from their own windows. Smith pressed on anyway. At 9:40 a.m., traveling at 200 miles per hour through the fog, disoriented, turned around after passing the Chrysler Building, Smith's bomber slammed into the north face of the Empire State Building between the 78th and 79th floors. The impact was catastrophic. One engine tore completely through the building and landed on a neighboring rooftop. The other engine, along with pieces of the landing gear, plummeted down an elevator shaft. Fuel ignited instantly. 3 separate fires erupted across 2 floors. 14 people died. But here's what's remarkable. The building didn't even shudder. The structural integrity held. 2 days later, the Empire State Building reopened for business. And Betty Lou Oliver, a 20-year-old elevator operator working on the 80th floor, survived something that should have killed her twice. First, the plane crash threw her from her elevator car, leaving her badly burned with a broken pelvis, back, and neck. Rescue workers placed her in another elevator to transport her to the ground floor for medical treatment. The cables had been damaged in the crash. Betty Lou Oliver fell 75 stories. The elevator car plummeted over 1,000 feet, compressing air in the shaft below, cables coiling like springs at the bottom, cushioning the impact just enough. When rescuers cut her from the mangled wreckage in the basement, she was conscious, injured, broken, but alive. She holds the Guinness World Record for surviving the longest elevator fall in history. This is the story of the building that refused to die. The building that shouldn't have worked, shouldn't have stood, shouldn't have survived. The building that opened during the worst economic collapse in American history and sat empty for years. The building they called Smith's Folly and the Empty State Building. The building that became the most famous skyscraper on Earth. This is the story of how 3,500 workers, many of them desperate immigrants and Mohawk iron workers who feared nothing but the weather, built the impossible in 410 days.
Before there was an Empire State Building, there was the grandest hotel in America. The original Waldorf Astoria stood at the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street. A palace of German Renaissance architecture, the jewel of Manhattan's Gilded Age. Built in 1893, it was the place where fortunes were made and lost, where presidents dined and society ladies gossiped over tea. 1,300 rooms, the most luxurious hotel in the world. The kind of place that made you feel like royalty just walking through the door. For 36 years, it defined elegance in New York City. And then they tore it down. The decision came in 1929, and it wasn't sentimental. The hotel's owners, the Astor family, had been offered an extraordinary price for the land, something in the neighborhood of $16 million. Empire State Inc., a consortium of investors led by John Jakob Raskob and former New York Governor Al Smith, had grand ambitions. They wanted to build something Manhattan had never seen before, the tallest building in the world. Demolition began on October 1st, 1929. 21 days later, the stock market crashed. But here's the thing about the Waldorf Astoria. Nobody expected it to be so hard to destroy. The hotel had been built magnificently well, with walls thicker than anyone anticipated, foundations that went deep into the Manhattan bedrock. What should have been a straightforward demolition turned into a brutal, expensive nightmare. It took longer than expected, cost far more money, and produced mountains of rubble that had to be carted away daily. Engineers had underestimated everything about the hotel's construction. Those thick walls, they required specialized equipment and extra crews. The foundations, so deep and so solid that they fought back against every attempt to break them apart. The schedule slipped, the budget ballooned. Al Smith and his investors watched nervously as their timeline collapsed before construction even began. This was supposed to be a symbol of American ambition and engineering prowess. Instead, it was starting to look like a very expensive mistake. Meanwhile, across town, 2 other skyscrapers were rising, and they were racing. The Chrysler Building, originally planned to be 808 feet tall, suddenly announced it would reach 925 feet. Not to be outdone, 40 Wall Street, first designed at 840 feet, quickly revised its plans to 927 feet, claiming the title of world's tallest building. Walter Chrysler, the automotive magnate behind the Chrysler Building, had a secret weapon. Architect William Van Allen had designed a 125-foot stainless steel spire assembled in secret inside the building's fire shaft. On October 23, 1929, the spire was hoisted through the top of the building and bolted into place in just 90 minutes. The Chrysler Building topped out at 1,046 feet, world's tallest building. The news media loved it. They called it the race into the sky, and the public couldn't get enough. Who would win? Would anyone dare go higher? Empire State Inc. was watching, and they weren't about to lose. John Jakob Raskob was a self-made man, the kind of American success story that makes for good mythology. He'd started as a secretary and risen to become a financial wizard, the man who helped create General Motors and turned it into an empire. He knew how to make money, and he knew how to make statements. Al Smith, his partner, was even more colorful. A 4-term governor of New York, a failed presidential candidate, the grandson of Irish immigrants who'd grown up in the tenements of the Lower East Side. He wore a brown derby hat and spoke with a thick accent. He knew everyone in the city, and everyone knew him. Together, they were determined to build something that would dwarf the Chrysler Building, something that would end the race for once and for all. The architects, Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon, were given a brutally simple brief: design the tallest building in the world, make it elegant, make it functional, make it fast, and make sure it's taller than anything Walter Chrysler could dream up. William F. Lamb, the lead architect, sketched the final design in just 2 hours the night before they were supposed to present it to the investors. The building would be 85 stories. No, wait, add a dirigible mooring mast, make it 102 stories. Height, 1,250 feet to the top of the mast. Chrysler's 1,046 feet didn't stand a chance. But there was a problem. The Waldorf Astoria still wasn't gone. Crews were working double shifts, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 600 men rotating through the demolition site. They were digging down 55 feet to create the foundation. The bedrock in Manhattan is solid, some of the best building foundation on Earth, but getting to it meant excavating millions of cubic feet of earth and debris. By January 22, 1930, excavation was finally complete. The rubble was gone. The site was ready. And on March 17, 1930, St. Patrick's Day, the first piece of structural steel was set. The race had officially begun.
William A. Sterrett, president of Sterrett Brothers in Eakin, the general contractors hired to build the Empire State Building, had a phrase he liked to use. Building skyscrapers is the nearest peacetime equivalent of war. He wasn't exaggerating. Sterrett had overseen the construction of numerous tall buildings.
During World War I, he'd managed all U.S. Army construction work for the War Industrial Board. He understood logistics, coordination, and the brutal reality that construction projects lived or died by their schedules. In 1928, he'd written a book called Skyscrapers and the Men Who Build Them, detailing everything he'd learned about building materials, planning, and the art of keeping thousands of workers moving like a well-oiled machine. Now he faced the challenge of his career: build a 102-story skyscraper in 18 months. 18 months for the tallest building in the world. Most engineers said it couldn't be done. A typical skyscraper of similar height took 3.5 stories per week at the fastest pace ever recorded. Starrett's team would need to average more than that, much more. They achieved 4.5 stories per week. The secret was coordination, obsessive, military-grade coordination. Starrett created a massive chart outlining every single phase of construction, down to the hour. He assembled a team of inspectors who roamed the site every day, recording the amount of work completed, identifying bottlenecks, solving problems before they became disasters. If a delivery was late, they knew immediately. If a crew was falling behind, they redistributed workers. If materials ran short, they had backup suppliers on standby. Nothing was left to chance. Steel fabrication was handled by 2 Pennsylvania companies, American Bridge Company and McClintock Marshall Company. The steel members were shipped by rail to a supply yard on the New Jersey waterfront, then barged across the Hudson River to an East River pier, and finally trucked to the construction site on 34th Street. But here's the genius part. They didn't store the steel on the street. Manhattan was too crowded, too busy. Instead, they created a temporary driveway between 33rd and 34th Streets and stored materials on the building's first floor and in the basement. Concrete mixers, brick hoppers, stone hoists, everything was inside the building itself. This meant the streets stayed clear, traffic flowed, the city didn't grind to a halt. At any given time, more than 200 trucks were making deliveries to the site every single day. The steel arrived coated. Each piece was marked with instructions indicating which derrick would lift it, which floor it belonged on, where it needed to go. The derricks, massive relay and erection cranes placed on platforms near the building, lifted the steel from the trucks and installed the beams at the appropriate locations. Speed was everything. In July 1930, 22 stories of steel were erected in 22 working days. No night shifts, just regular hours and perfect coordination. By September 10, 1930, less than 6 months after the first steel was set, the cornerstone was laid in a ceremony attended by thousands. The stone contained a time capsule, the previous day's New York Times, a complete set of U.S. currency from 1930, a history of the site, and photographs of everyone involved in the construction. On September 19, 1930, just 23 weeks after the start of construction, the steel topped out at 1,048 feet. The race was over. The Empire State Building had won. But they weren't done yet. The airship mooring mast still needed to be built, and more importantly, the building needed to be finished inside. Electrical systems, plumbing, floors, walls, windows, elevators, all the 1,000 details that turn a steel skeleton into a functioning building. Inside, they used miniature railroad tracks to transport materials horizontally through each floor. The cars held 8 times more than a wheelbarrow and required minimal effort to push. Efficiency at every level. The building's facade employed a pioneering curtain wall design. The 6,500 windows were integrated into the wall itself, simplifying stonework and using 75% less stone than comparable skyscrapers. This meant the walls for each floor could be set at a rate of 1 story per day. During peak construction in September 1930, 14 floors were completed in 10 days.
At the height of construction, 3,500 workers were on site. On a single day, August 14, 1930, there were exactly 3,439 people working on the Empire State Building. Many of them were Irish and Italian immigrants, men who'd arrived in New York with nothing, desperate for work during a time when jobs were scarce and hunger was real. The Great Depression was tightening its grip on America. Unemployment was skyrocketing, banks were failing, families were losing their homes. But here, on this construction site, there was work. Hard work, dangerous work, but work that paid. And among them were the Mohawks.
They came from Kanawake, a Mohawk reserve near Montreal. They traveled down from Akwesasne, straddling the borders of Ontario, Quebec, and New York State. They were iron workers, members of the Kanien'keha people, and they were building New York City. The Mohawk involvement in high steel construction began in 1886 when the Canadian Pacific Railroad contracted the Dominion Bridge Company to build a cantilever bridge across the St. Lawrence River. One end of the bridge would sit on Kanawake Reservation land, and in exchange for permission, the company agreed to hire Mohawk men as day laborers. The Mohawks weren't interested in unloading materials. They wanted to work on the bridge itself. Foremen watched, skeptical at first, as these men climbed the steel girders effortlessly, walking across narrow beams hundreds of feet above the water with the kind of balance and fearlessness that seemed impossible. One supervisor said they were as agile as goats, immune to the noise of riveting, which usually makes newcomers to construction sick and dizzy. They were hired on the spot. Over the next 2 decades, Mohawk ironworkers became legendary. They worked on bridges across Canada and the United States, traveling from job to job, sending money back to their communities. They apprenticed their own sons, keeping the skills within their families. By the 1920s, Mohawk riveting gangs were showing up on every major construction project in North America. In New York City, they helped build the George Washington Bridge, the Triborough Bridge, the Chrysler Building, Rockefeller Plaza, and the Empire State Building. Riveting was the most dangerous job on any construction site. 4-man teams worked in perfect synchronization hundreds of feet above the street. The heater fired rivets in a portable forge until they were red hot, then tossed them to the stickerin, who caught them in a metal can or glove. The bucker-up braced the rivet with a dolly bar, while the riveter used a pneumatic hammer to mushroom out the rivet stem, securing the steel. If one member of the team was sick and didn't show up, nobody on that team went to work. Their coordination was so specific, so finely tuned that an interloper couldn't fill in. They were a unit. They lived or died together. The Mohawks spoke their native languages on the job. They sang songs from home. They took pride in their work and their heritage. But they also faced racism. They were paid less than their white colleagues. Many labor unions refused to admit them. And yet they kept working, kept building, kept walking the high steel. Joe Carbonell, who was 16 years old when he worked on the Empire State Building, remembered it years later. It was kind of a thrill working on the beams. I learned don't look down, just look to the end of the beam. The one thing the Skywalkers feared was weather. Rain made the steel slippery. One wrong step and you fell. Bitter cold made hands stiff and numb, unable to grip. Wind could throw you off balance. These were the conditions that killed ironworkers, and the Mohawks knew it. 5 workers died during the construction of the Empire State Building. Rumors circulated of more. Some newspapers claimed 14 deaths. Others spread unfounded stories of 42. But the official record stands at 5. One struck by a truck, others lost to falls and accidents. For a project of this scale and speed, it was remarkably low. But each death was a tragedy, and the Mohawk community in particular felt every loss. Many Mohawks moved their families to Brooklyn, creating a neighborhood called Little Caughnawaga, an early spelling of Kanawake, near 4th Avenue and Atlantic Avenue. By 1960, around 800 Mohawks lived there.
The Wigwam Bar on Nevis Street sported a sign, "The greatest iron workers in the world pass through these doors." They stocked Montreal beers and ingredients for favorite Mohawk recipes like cornbread with beans. The local church, run by Reverend David Munro Corey, offered services in the Mohawk language. Corey had learned the dialect from his parishioners and even translated the Gospel of Luke and a book of hymns. They called it Anansa Tokenti Waten Rosens, the church that makes friends. The 1994 Jay Treaty guaranteed that Mohawks could pass freely between Canada and the United States, but the 12-hour drive from Brooklyn to Kanawake meant that many families settled permanently in New York. They became part of the city's fabric, building its skyline while maintaining their culture and identity. On September 19, 1930, a Mohawk worker placed the final piece of steel at the top of the Empire State Building's frame. The crowd below cheered. The race into the sky was won. While the workers built the building, one man documented their every move. Louis Wicks Hine was 56 years old in 1930, a school teacher turned photographer who'd made a name for himself photographing child laborers in factories, exposing the brutal conditions that led to labor reforms. He used his camera as a weapon for social change, and he was very good at it. Empire State Inc. commissioned him to photograph the construction for advertising purposes. They wanted dramatic images, iconic shots that would sell the building to the world. Hine gave them more than they bargained for. He didn't photograph from the ground, he climbed. He put himself in the same positions as the workers, hooked up to safety lines, though not always, swinging out on specially designed baskets suspended 1,000 feet above Fifth Avenue. He wanted to capture what the workers saw, what they felt. The resulting photographs are some of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Men eating lunch on steel beams, legs dangling over the void. Ironworkers in mid-air, balanced impossibly, the city sprawling below them like a toy model. The sun creating stark contrasts of light and shadow on the steel framework, the hazy buildings in the distance looking insignificant compared to the towering structure rising above them. Hine called the workers men of courage, skill, daring, and imagination. He said, "I wanted to show things that had to be appreciated." One of his most famous images shows workers installing rivets near the top of the building, the Chrysler Building visible in the background, already conquered. Another shows a man standing on a beam, seemingly floating in space, the ground invisible far below. These weren't posed publicity shots. They were real, dangerous, honest. Hine understood that these men were doing something extraordinary, and he wanted the world to see it, not from a distance, not sanitized and safe, but raw and real. The photographs captured the wonder and terror of building a skyscraper, the artistry and the risk. Today, his photographs are displayed in museums around the world. They're on display at the International Center of Photography in New York. They've been reproduced in thousands of books and articles. And they remind us that behind every great structure are real people, taking real risks, doing work that matters. On April 11, 1931, exactly 410 days after construction began, the Empire State Building was complete, 12 days ahead of schedule. Former Governor Al Smith ceremonially shot the final rivet, made of solid gold, into place. Cameras flashed, workers cheered. It was a moment of triumph, a middle finger to the Great Depression, a statement that America could still build, still dream, still achieve the impossible. The final cost? $40.9 million, significantly under budget. Over 3,500 workers had been employed at the project's peak. They'd used 60,000 tons of steel, 10 million bricks, 730 tons of aluminum and stainless steel, 6,514 windows, and enough wire and cable to stretch from New York to San Francisco. The building stood 1,250 feet tall to the top of the mooring mast, 102 stories, 73 elevators, 1,860 steps from the ground floor to the 102nd floor. The fastest elevator could travel from the lobby to the 80th floor in less than 1 minute. It was, without question, the tallest building in the world, and it would hold that title for nearly 40 years. But here's the thing nobody talks about enough. The construction itself was almost more impressive than the finished product. Consider what they'd accomplished. In just over a year, working through a brutal New York winter, they'd erected a 102-story steel-framed skyscraper, installed all the electrical and plumbing systems, finished the interior spaces, and completed the exterior facade. They'd done it faster than anyone thought possible, under budget, and with only 5 fatalities on a project employing thousands. The coordination required was military in scope. The logistics were staggering. The engineering challenges were unprecedented. And they'd done it all during the worst economic collapse in American history. The opening ceremony was scheduled for May 1st, 1931. President Herbert Hoover would ceremonially turn on the building's lights from the White House. Franklin D. Roosevelt, then governor of New York, would attend. Al Smith and his team had invited dignitaries from around the world. Everything was ready, except for one problem. Nobody wanted to rent office space in the world's tallest building during the Great Depression. The Great Depression had America by the throat. The stock market had crashed in October 1929. Banks were failing across the country. Nearly half of all U.S. banks would close by the time the Depression ended. Unemployment hit 25%. 13 million Americans were out of work. Family incomes had plummeted by 40% in just 3 years. New York City wasn't immune. Bread lines stretched around blocks. Homeless encampments, called Hoovervilles after the president, sprang up in Central Park and along the rivers. Businesses were closing. People were desperate. And Al Smith was trying to rent out 2.7 million square feet of office space in the middle of Manhattan. On May 1st, 1931, the Empire State Building officially opened. President Hoover pressed a button in Washington, D.C., and the building's lights blazed to life. Thousands attended the ceremony. NBC and CBS broadcast the event on radio. The Hotel McAlpin Band played the Star-Spangled Banner. It was a triumph of engineering and architecture. The newspapers called it the world's loftiest building and the 8th wonder of the world. But in the first year, only 23% of the available space was rented. 23%. The typical building in the 1920s would be 52% occupied when it opened and reach 90% within 5 years. The Empire State Building couldn't even hit 25%. Everything above the 41st floor sat empty. The higher the office, the higher the rent, and nobody was willing to pay premium prices during an economic catastrophe. Workers were told to leave lights on in the vacant spaces to create the illusion of occupancy. New Yorkers started calling it the Empty State Building. Some called it Smith's Folly. British newspapers ran daily stories about American economic collapse, gleefully reporting that the Empire State Building was now known as the Empty State Building and had become a monument to overreach and hubris. By 1935, the building was losing $1 million per year, equivalent to about $20.8 million today. The problem wasn't just the Depression. Manhattan had experienced a 92% increase in office space inventory during the 1920s building boom. The Empire State Building opened into a market flooded with vacant offices. The Chrysler Building, Rockefeller Center, buildings on 42nd Street, they were all competing for the same shrinking pool of tenants. And the Empire State Building was farther from public transportation hubs than its competitors. It was 9 blocks from Grand Central Terminal, 2 blocks from Penn Station. The Chrysler Building, by contrast, was right at Grand Central. Location mattered. Al Smith took on the job of marketing the building personally.
He advertised aggressively in newspapers, on railroad tickets, anywhere he could. He called in favors, leveraged his political connections, begged friends and associates to rent space. Some of the earliest tenants were large companies and banks. NBC leased the 85th floor. Garment industries moved in, but it wasn't nearly enough. Here's the irony. The observation deck saved them. 1 million people paid $1 each to ride the elevators to the 86th floor observatory in 1931. That's $1 million in revenue, more than they were making from office rents. By 1938, the observatory was generating at least $1 million annually, and it became the building's primary source of income for years. People wanted to see the view. They wanted to stand at the top of the world's tallest building and look out over the city. The Depression couldn't kill that dream. But the financial situation was dire. John Jakob Raskob had to inject his own money into the building. Metropolitan Insurance Company, one of the major backers, moved some of their operations into the building just to help fill space and generate rent. The investors were drowning in red ink. The building had become a national symbol of economic overreach, proof that even the grandest ambitions could fail when the economy collapsed. It would take nearly 20 years before the Empire State Building turned a profit. 20 years! The 200-foot mooring mast at the top of the Empire State Building was supposed to revolutionize transportation. According to the promotional materials, dirigibles, massive hydrogen-filled airships like the Graf Zeppelin, would dock at the building's spire. Passengers would disembark at the 102nd floor via a gangplank, then take an elevator down to street level. The entire process would take just 7 minutes. Manhattan would become the center of transatlantic air travel. The Empire State Building would be an airport in the sky. It was brilliant marketing. It added 200 feet to the building's height, ensuring they would beat the Chrysler Building. And it captured the public's imagination in a way nothing else could. There was just one problem. It was completely impractical. Dr. Hugo Echner, commander of the Graf Zeppelin and the world's leading expert on dirigibles, said flatly that the project would never work. Quote, "The air over a city is as irregular and spotty as the crags of the skyscrapers, particularly at the level of building tops," he explained. As a result, the ship would be in constant danger of veering off and crashing into some other building, even on a quiet day. End quote. Nobody had consulted the Germans who actually operated the Zeppelins before designing the mooring mast. The entire plan was created without input from the only people who knew whether it could actually work. The wind at 1,250 feet was ferocious. It often blew at 30 to 45 miles per hour, creating treacherous eddies and unpredictable gusts. Mooring an airship required dozens of ground crew with ropes to stabilize it. You couldn't just tie it to a pole and walk away. And even if you could dock the airship, passengers would have to walk down a gangplank from a swaying, unstable platform a quarter mile above the street, in wind, with no safety harnesses. It was insane. On September 15, 1931, a small private dirigible attempted to dock. It circled the building 25 times in 45-mile-per-hour winds, trying to find a stable approach. When it finally attempted to tie off, the ballast spilled, the craft was rocked by unpredictable eddies, and the whole thing nearly ended in disaster. They managed to stay attached for 3 minutes before giving up. 2 weeks later, the Goodyear blimp Columbia lowered a stack of newspapers to a man on the tower using a 100-foot line. It returned the next day but couldn't repeat the feat. That was it. The last recorded attempt to use the Empire State Building as an airship dock. The famous photograph showing the Navy dirigible Los Angeles docked at the Empire State Building, it's a composite, a fake, created by International News Photos for promotional purposes, but the actual docking never happened. The entire mooring mast idea was likely a ruse to add height to the building. The New York Times later noted that the mast camouflaged the quest for boasting rights to the world's tallest building, an ambition to which it seemed indecent to admit. When the building opened in May 1931, the apparatus needed to winch airships into place hadn't even been designed, let alone installed. The mooring mast was Manhattan's most expensive folly, but it gave the building its iconic spire, the distinctive silhouette that would define the New York skyline for generations. And in 1937, when the Hindenburg burst into flames in Lakehurst, New Jersey, killing 36 people and effectively ending the commercial airship era, the failed mooring mast became a historical curiosity rather than a practical failure. The spire was later repurposed as a broadcast antenna, and today it transmits signals for 25 television stations and 19 FM radio stations. NBC began experimenting with television broadcasts from the top of the building as early as 1931. In 1951, a 203-foot steel antenna was added to support multiple stations. The mooring mast that never worked became one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in broadcasting history. 14 years after it opened, the Empire State Building faced its greatest test. Saturday, July 28, 1945. Dense fog blanketed Manhattan. Visibility near zero. The war in Europe was over. VE Day had been declared 7 weeks earlier. Japan's surrender was imminent. America was weeks away from peace. Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith, Jr., the decorated bomber pilot from our cold open, was flying a routine personnel transport mission. B-25 Mitchell bomber, 2 passengers, Bedford, Massachusetts to Newark Airport. LaGuardia Tower warned him about the weather. They couldn't see the Empire State Building from their windows. He should land at LaGuardia or turn back. Smith decided to press on to Newark. He became disoriented in the fog. After passing the Chrysler Building, he turned right instead of left. He was flying too low, far too low for the number of skyscrapers in Midtown Manhattan. Office workers on high floors saw his plane fly beneath them, the engines roaring, the bomber barely clearing buildings. At 9:40 a.m., traveling at 200 miles per hour, Smith's B-25 slammed into the north face of the Empire State Building between the 78th and 79th floors, 913 feet above 34th Street. The impact created an 18 by 20-foot hole in the building's exterior. One engine tore completely through the structure, flew across an entire city block, and crashed through the roof of a penthouse apartment, starting a fire. The other engine and pieces of the landing gear plummeted down an elevator shaft. Fuel ignited immediately. 3 separate fires erupted. Temperatures soared. Steel glowed red-hot. Smoke billowed through multiple floors. All 3 men in the plane died instantly. Smith and his passengers were burned beyond recognition. Inside the building, chaos. On the 79th floor, the National Catholic Welfare Conference offices were in flames. Therese Fortier-Willig, 20 years old, was working that morning. She watched her supervisor, Joe Fountain, walk through the office with his head and clothes on fire. 6 people managed to get into an untouched office and close the door before the flames engulfed them. They covered their mouths with handkerchiefs, waited by an open window, uncertain if anyone would come. One man, Paul Deering, panicked and jumped to his death. Willig removed the rings from her fingers and threw them out the window, certain she was about to die. "It was a very small universe at that point," she said years later. "You're sort of stuck there, on an island with fire all around us." Firemen arrived and rescued the survivors. Willig made it out, one of the lucky ones. 11 people in the building died that day. 20 to 24 others were injured. And Betty Lou Oliver, the elevator operator on the 80th floor, survived the impossible. The initial impact threw her from her elevator car. She suffered severe burns, a broken pelvis, a broken back, a broken neck. First aid workers reached her, stabilized her, placed her on a stretcher,
and put her in another elevator to transport her to the ground floor for medical treatment. Nobody realized the elevator cables had been damaged in the crash. As soon as the car began its descent, the cables snapped. Betty Lou Oliver fell 75 stories, over 1,000 feet. The elevator car plummeted at breakneck speed, accelerating toward the basement. She remained conscious the entire fall. "I started yelling and pounding on the floor," she told her sister later. "That's the last thing I remember." When the car crashed into the basement, the coiled cables at the bottom of the shaft acted like springs, cushioning the impact slightly. The air compressed in the shaft below, creating a pneumatic cushion that slowed the fall just enough. The elevator's automatic braking system engaged in the final moments, creating friction that helped reduce the speed. It still should have killed her. When rescuers found her in the mangled wreckage at the bottom of the shaft, she was conscious, critically injured, but alive. She spent 24 weeks in the hospital recovering from her injuries. The Guinness Book of World Records later recognized her for surviving the longest elevator fall in history, a record that still stands. The building itself barely noticed the crash. The structural integrity held perfectly. There was no swaying, no collapse, no catastrophic failure. Engineers examined the damage and found that while the hole in the exterior was dramatic, the building's skeleton, the steel frame that held everything together, was intact. 2 days later, the Empire State Building reopened for business. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. A 10-ton bomber, traveling at 200 miles per hour, hit the building at 913 feet above street level, killed 14 people, started 3 major fires, and punched a hole through the facade, and the building shrugged it off. The crash proved what William Starlett and his team had built, a structure so strong, so well-engineered, that even a direct hit from a military aircraft couldn't bring it down. Compare this to September 11, 2001, when planes hit the World Trade Center towers. Those towers collapsed. The Empire State Building, built 70 years earlier with 1930s technology, survived its plane crash with minimal structural damage. The difference was design. The Empire State Building's steel frame was dense and redundant. The exterior walls were load-bearing. The connections were riveted, not welded. Every piece of the building was overbuilt by modern standards, designed with safety margins that would seem excessive today. In 1945, that overbuilding saved lives and prevented a catastrophe.
On March 2, 1933, a film premiered at Radio City Music Hall that would change the Empire State Building forever. King Kong. The story is simple. Giant ape is captured and brought to New York. Giant ape falls in love with beautiful woman. Giant ape escapes, climbs the tallest building in the world, gets shot down by biplanes. That last scene, Kong atop the Empire State Building, swatting at planes, clutching Ann Darrow in one massive paw while the city sprawls below, became one of the most iconic images in cinema history. The building had only been open for 2 years. It was still struggling financially, still called the Empty State Building by cynical New Yorkers, and suddenly it was a movie star. King Kong was a sensation. It grossed $1.8 million during its initial theatrical run, equivalent to about $42 million today. Audiences packed theaters. The Empire State Building became instantly recognizable worldwide, even to people who'd never been to New York. The film didn't use the real building, of course. Willis O'Brien and his team created miniature models and used stop-motion animation to bring Kong to life. But the accuracy of the model and the dramatic power of the scene cemented the Empire State Building in the global imagination. It wasn't just a skyscraper anymore. It was a symbol, a stage, the place where myths played out. Over the decades, the building would appear in hundreds of films. Sleepless in Seattle, 1993, featured a romantic climax at the observation deck. An Affair to Remember, 1957, did the same. Elf, 2003, had Will Ferrell's character climb the outside of the building. Independence Day 1996 showed it being destroyed by aliens. But none of them matched King Kong. That image, the ape on the spire, defiant against impossible odds, became inseparable from the building itself. The Empire State Building embraced its celebrity. They installed special lighting in 1964 to mark the New York World's Fair, illuminating the top 30 floors. In 1976, they added colored floodlights that could change to mark holidays, events, and celebrations. Red, white, and blue for Independence Day, green for St. Patrick's Day, red and green for Christmas, rainbow colors for Pride Month. The building became a canvas, a beacon, a way for New York to celebrate and mourn and remember. When a beloved New Yorker died, they dimmed the lights or changed the colors in tribute. When the Yankees won the World Series, the lights went blue and white. When New York passed marriage equality, the lights went rainbow. The building became more than architecture. It became emotion, made visible in light. In 2012, they installed a new LED lighting system with 16 million color combinations. The building could now display complex patterns, animations, moving images. They synchronized the lights to music, to events, to the heartbeat of the city. And through it all, the Empire State Building remained what King Kong had made it, the most famous building in the world.
In 1951, 20 years after it opened, the Empire State Building finally turned a profit. The post-war economic boom had arrived. Office space in Manhattan was suddenly valuable again. Companies were expanding. The building's occupancy rate climbed to 95% and stayed there. But ownership was about to become extremely complicated. John Jakob Raskob and his original investment group had long since given up control. In 1951, they sold the building to Roger L. Stevens and his partners, Chicago businessmen Alfred R. Glancy, Ben Tobin, and Henry Crown, for $51 million, $607 million in today's dollars. It was the most expensive real estate transaction in American history at that time. The buyers didn't buy the building, they bought a lease. The land beneath the Empire State Building was still owned by someone else. This arrangement, separating the building from the land, would create legal chaos for the next 50 years. In 1961, Lawrence A. Wien and Peter L. Malkin purchased the building for $65 million, but they didn't buy the land either. The Astor family still owned that. Wien and Malkin structured the purchase as a syndication, selling shares to 3,300 individual investors. This made the Empire State Building the most widely held piece of real estate in America. But it also made management a nightmare. Every major decision required approval from thousands of shareholders. Renovations dragged on for years. Maintenance became a political battle. The building started to age, visibly and badly. Meanwhile, the land lease, the agreement that allowed the building to exist on someone else's property, was scheduled to expire in 2076, and the Helmsley family, who'd acquired control of both the building and a separate lease on the land, were in the middle of their own war. Harry Helmsley was a real estate genius. He'd built an empire of hotels and office buildings across New York. In 1961, he helped Lawrence Wien structure the Empire State Building syndication. By the 1980s, he controlled the building's management through a complex series of leases and subleases. His wife, Leona Helmsley, was ruthless. A former model and businesswoman, she ran Helmsley's hotel empire with an iron fist. She famously said, "We don't pay taxes, only the little people pay taxes." That quote came back to haunt her. In 1989, Leona Helmsley was convicted of federal income tax evasion and sentenced to prison. She served 18 months. Harry Helmsley died in 1997. His widow inherited control of the Empire State Building, and for the next 15 years, she fought off challenges from the Malkin family and other stakeholders who wanted to modernize the building. Leona refused. She blocked renovations. She resisted any changes to the building's operations. The Empire State Building, once the pinnacle of modernity, was stuck in the 1960s. The lobbies were outdated. The elevators were slow. The windows were drafty. The building was losing tenants to newer, more efficient skyscrapers. Peter L. Malkin and his son, Anthony, wanted to take the building public, create a real estate investment trust that would raise capital for renovations and give shareholders liquidity. Leona blocked them at every turn. She died in 2007, leaving most of her $4 billion estate to her dog, a Maltese named Trouble. A judge later reduced the dog's inheritance to $2 million, deeming the original $12 million excessive. With Leona gone, the Malkin family moved quickly. In 2010, they initiated a plan to consolidate ownership and create the Empire State Real Estate Trust. It was a hostile takeover disguised as modernization. Shareholders revolted. Some sued. Others demanded a better deal. Donald Trump inserted himself into the fight, trying to buy the building outright. His bid failed, but the publicity stunt delayed the process. Finally, in 2013, the Empire State Real Estate Trust went public on the New York Stock Exchange. The building was valued at $2.5 billion. After 82 years, the Empire State Building was finally under unified control. And they immediately began renovations. The $550 million renovation that began in 2009 transformed the Empire State Building into one of the most energy-efficient buildings in New York. Every single one of the 6,514 windows was removed, refurbished, and reinstalled. They added insulating gas between the panes, coated the glass with a reflective film, and installed insulating panels behind the radiators. The result? 38% reduction in energy use for heating and cooling. They upgraded the chiller plant, replaced the air conditioning system, and modernized the building controls. Carbon emissions dropped by 105,000 metric tons over 15 years. In 2011, the building received a LEED Gold certification for energy efficiency, the first skyscraper of its size and age to achieve this. But the most dramatic change was the lobbies. The Fifth Avenue entrance was reimagined with marble floors, restored ceiling murals, and sleek modern lighting. The 1930s Art Deco details were carefully preserved and enhanced. The elevator cabs were refurbished with period-appropriate materials. They created a museum on the second floor, documenting the building's construction and history. They installed interactive exhibits showing Lewis Hines photographs and the stories of the workers who'd built the impossible. The observation decks were expanded and modernized. They added floor-to-ceiling windows on the 102nd floor, giving visitors a 360-degree view without obstruction. On a clear day, you can see 80 miles in every direction into 5 states. 4 million people visit the Empire State Building observation decks every year. It's the most popular tourist attraction in New York City. The building generates more than $1 billion annually in tourism-related economic activity. It employs over 1,000 people directly. The observation deck alone brings in $120 million per year. But the Empire State Building is more than a tourist attraction. It remains a functioning office building with high-profile tenants. LinkedIn, Shutterstock, Coty, and dozens of other companies lease space. The building is 93% occupied, a number it's maintained for decades. It broadcasts signals for 25 television stations and 19 FM radio stations. The antenna at the top of the spire is worth hundreds of millions of dollars in broadcasting contracts, and it remains an icon. When people think of New York City, they think of the Empire State Building. It's appeared on more postcards, in more films, in more photographs than any other structure in America. In 2007, the American Society of Civil Engineers named it one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, alongside the Panama Canal, the Golden Gate Bridge, and the Channel Tunnel. In 2018, it became one of the first buildings in the United States to achieve Fitwel virus response certification during the COVID-19 pandemic. The building that was supposed to be a folly, that sat empty for years, that was derided as Smith's Folly and the empty State Building, has outlasted almost every other skyscraper from its era. The Chrysler Building, its rival, has struggled with vacancy and maintenance problems. Rockefeller Center has been sold multiple times. Buildings once considered iconic have been demolished or overshadowed. But the Empire State Building endures. On September 11, 1991, the world changed. 2 planes struck the World Trade Center towers. Both towers collapsed. 2,977 people died. New York City was in shock. America was in shock. And for one day, one impossible, terrible day, the Empire State Building was once again the tallest building in New York City. It hadn't asked for that distinction. It didn't want it. But there it was, standing over a skyline that had been ripped apart, a reminder of what New York had been and what it would be again. In the days and weeks after 9/11, the Empire State Building became a symbol of resilience. The lights at the top stayed lit. The building remained open. People came to the observation deck, not just to see the view, but to bear witness, to grieve, to remember. The building that had survived a bomber crash in 1945 was now a monument to survival itself. New Yorkers understood something that day. Buildings matter. Not just as structures, but as symbols, as anchors, as proof that we can build something that lasts, something that refuses to fall, something that endures. The Empire State Building has always been about defiance. It was built during the Great Depression when everyone said it couldn't be done. It opened into an economy that couldn't support it and survived anyway. It took a direct hit from a military aircraft and shrugged it off. It languished in obscurity for years and became the most famous building in the world. Today, it stands 1,454 feet tall to the top of the antenna. It's no longer the tallest building in New York. That title belongs to One World Trade Center, built on the site where the Twin Towers once stood. But height was never really the point. The point was audacity. The point was showing that humans can build something extraordinary even when the world is falling apart. The point was that 3,500 workers, many of them immigrants, many of them desperate for work, could come together and create something that would outlast them all. The Mohawk iron workers who walked the high steel are mostly gone now. The last of them retired in the 1990s, but their descendants still work in construction, still carry on the tradition. The Kanawake Reserve near Montreal still sends workers to build New York City's skyline. The immigrants from Ireland and Italy who riveted and welded and hauled materials are gone too, but their children and grandchildren are New Yorkers, part of the fabric of the city. Lewis Hines' photographs hang in museums. Betty Lou Oliver lived to be 74, passing away in 1999. Al Smith never lived to see the building turn a profit, but he saw it become famous. And William Starrett's name is engraved on a plaque in the lobby, alongside all the architects and engineers and workers who made the impossible real.
On March 17, 1930, the first piece of structural steel was set into the bedrock of Manhattan. 410 days later, the Empire State Building was complete. It shouldn't have worked. The economy was collapsing, the site was difficult, the timeline was impossible, the height was unprecedented, the engineering challenges were immense. But 3,500 workers showed up every day and did the work. They walked steel beams a quarter mile above the street. They riveted and welded in freezing wind. They coordinated deliveries and logistics with military precision. They built 4.5 stories per week and made it look routine. And when it was done, they'd created something that would define New York City for generations. The Empire State Building is more than a skyscraper. It's a statement. It's proof that humans can achieve the impossible when we refuse to accept limitations. It's a monument to the workers who built it, to the immigrants who came to America with nothing and built everything, to the engineers who solved problems nobody had faced before. It's a building that survived a plane crash and reopened 2 days later. A building that sat empty for years and became the most famous structure in the world. A building that was built during the worst economic collapse in history and stands as a symbol of American resilience. And it all happened in 410 days. Today, the Empire State Building lights up every night, visible for miles, a beacon in the Manhattan skyline. The colors change to mark holidays, to honor heroes, to celebrate and mourn. But the light isn't just decoration, it's a reminder. A reminder that we built this, that we can build anything, that even in the darkest times, we can create something beautiful, something lasting, something that refuses to fall. The Empire State Building stands because 3,500 workers believed it could. And 93 years later, it's still standing.